So this week I thought I'd engage in a bit of a change of... Okay, so this week I thought I'd engage in a certain change of pace in terms of the coverage of the materials. Last time we dealt with fixed capital in all of its diversity and all of the complications that surround it. And I want to go back over some of that, but just do it through a very close reading of the original text. So I want to, if you like, ask questions about particular passages in this part of the text, and we're going from page 699 onwards to about 710, and asking a lot of questions about exactly what Marx means by certain statements. He has earlier, of course, dealt with the way in which fixated capital hardens into the circulation process of fixed capital. He's decided that fixed capital has its own circulation process, which relates to circulating capital and the circulation of the labour capacity. So on 699, in the new section that he continues, he starts off by saying this: the full development of capital, therefore, takes place only when the means of labour has not only taken the economic form of fixed capital, but has also been suspended in its immediate form, and when fixed capital appears as a machine within the production process opposite labour, and the entire production process appears as not subsumed under the direct skillfulness of the worker, but rather as the technological application of science. It is hence the tendency of capital to give production a scientific character. Then a bit further down the page. Thus, the quantitative extent and the effectiveness, intensity, to which capital is developed as fixed capital indicate the general degree to which capital is developed as capital, as power over living labour. And then he goes on further on down the page to say, this in no way means that the use value, machinery as such, is capital, or that its existence as machinery is identical with its existence as capital. Machinery does not lose its use value as soon as it ceases to be capital. While machinery is the most appropriate form of use value of fixed capital, it does not at all follow that therefore subsumption under the social relations of capital is the most appropriate and ultimate social relation of production for the application of machinery. So in the last part of that statement, what he's doing is to say just because you see a machine, you can't call it capital. A machine only becomes capital because it is used in a certain way. And this opens up the possibility to ask the question, how would machines be used under socialism? Is there a possible utilization? And Marx is answering, you can't rule out the transition to socialism just because you want to use machines. In fact, there is a socialist way in which you might consider using machines. Now, he doesn't say what that way is, but he wishes to release this, get us away from the idea that machinery is capital, and that therefore, if you want to use machines, you're definitely using capital, and so there's no escape from capital once you start using machines. And he's saying that's not the case. You can use machines in a socialistic way, and the manner of their utilization, and so is that matters. And this corresponds, of course, back to this idea that use value is critical for the definition of machines. Machines are use values of a certain kind, and if you could change the use values, the machines can still exist, but incorporate different use values into them. But at the same time, he's also, in the first part of that statement, the beginning, suggested that there is a radical transition occurring within the capitalist mode of production through the introduction of machinery and through the way in which that machinery incorporates scientific and technological understandings into the labour process. Now again, this is something which is going to crop up in this argument, and it crops up really from the very beginning, so we should get used to the idea now, and that is this: that Marx has defined capital in a certain way up till now. Up until 2 sessions ago, the question of fixed capital had not really arisen. And we therefore laid out, if you like, the laws of motion of capital as they operate in the absence of fixed capital. But now he's looking at what happens when fixed capital is introduced. And the first point is to say, fixed capital is incredibly important to a capitalist mode of production. It is so important that in a certain way, the introduction of fixed capital and the introduction of science and so on is actually completing the mission of capital, so that you don't have a truly capitalist mode of production if you don't, at the same time, have the introduction of science and technology and machine technology introduced. In other words, the introduction of machine technology is completing, in some ways, the definition of what a capitalist mode of production is about. This crops up in Capital, of course, in the long chapter on machinery and modern industry. The same argument is made that capital ultimately has a transition in its technological makeup, a transition which is true to its nature. In other words, capital early on is working with the kind of artisan labor and skills and so on, and knowledge and all the rest of it. It builds a certain notion of capital on what Marx called the machine period, but then ultimately there's a transition in the labor process away from the technologies of an artisan structure with its divisions of labor and so on, to a more classical kind of factory system, in which machine technology is now replacing the skills of the laborer, and that therefore the skills of the laborer are incorporated within the machine technology. So he's making the argument here, as he makes in Capital, that the true nature of capital is one in which fixed capital will have a prominent place, particularly machine technology, and that the introduction of that changes the positionality of the laborer in relationship to production. The laborer no longer dominates, if you like, the technology. The laborer is a machine minder, and the technology dominates the laborer rather than the laborer dominating the technology. So this is, if you like, the argument he has at the very opening of this section. And then he goes on to say, to the degree that labour time, and this is another shift, is posited by capital as the sole determinant element, to that degree does direct labour and its quantity disappear as a determinant principle of production, of the creation of use values, and is reduced both quantitatively to a smaller proportion and qualitatively as an, of course, indispensable but subordinate moment compared to general scientific labour, technological application of natural sciences on one side, and to the general productive force arising from social combination in total production on the other side. Capital thus works towards its own dissolution as the form dominating production. Now this is an interesting idea. Why would Marx kind of say this is about capital work? On the one hand, he's saying the introduction of all of this machine technology and machine systems and science and technology is bringing capital to its ultimate point of in its configuration. On one hand, he seems to be saying that, but then he's saying, but that also points as to a moment of dissolution. I think it's interesting in reading these passages to wonder, and I've done this occasionally, what was Marx reading when he was writing all this stuff? And there was a couple of citations. One is by somebody called Hodgson, called Labour Defended, and the other is an anonymous pamphlet about the remedies. I forget what's the exact title of it. It's The Source and Remedy of the National Difficulties, and it's an anonymous pamphlet. And in the third volume of Theories of Surplus Value, Marx actually does a complete analysis of that pamphlet, and it's a pamphlet which is opposed to some of Ricardo's presumptions. And Hodgkin as well is, if you like, going beyond Ricardo. And both Hodgkin and the author of this anonymous pamphlet in some ways get close to the definition of surplus value as something labor time extracted from labor power. And they get close to that. So they've taken the labor theory of value, and they've started to see that this has within it the possibility of the kind of labor theory of value that Marx is eventually going to come up with. But here is Marx saying machinery enters only where labor capacity is on hand in masses, and at the same time is going to work towards its own dissolution as the form dominating production. Now, at various points, and it's important to remember this, at various points Marx takes the view that the transition to socialism will entail the abolition of the labor theory of value. In other words, the labor theory of value is something which is distinctively capitalistic, and that therefore the transition from socialism must come up with an alternative theory of value which is not the labor theory of value. Therefore, the dissolution of the labor theory of value is not something which is sort of strange to Marx. It is something which you would want to encourage. And so one of the things that you'll find in these passages about machinery and so on is there's sort of hovering in the background this question of how would socialists appropriate machine technology, which is an issue I've already raised, but also to what degree does machine technology open up the possibility for this transition? Now, this is something we've gone through, I think, several times in the history of capitalism. That is, there seems to be a utopian moment, almost, in which the transition to socialism becomes possible to imagine because of the technological situation and which capital is imposing. I think you could see examples of this in the origins of social media and peer-to-peer computing and things of that sort. The idea that somehow or other this new technology is not only to be used by capital, which of course ultimately it was pretty exclusively, but which opens up the possibility for a socialist transition. And in the background, I think, to these pages here, and that is also true of the two prime sources, the anonymous pamphleteer and Hodgkin, there is the kind of the idea that maybe somewhere lurking in this whole kind of machine technology and so on is the possibility of using this in a socialistic way, and therefore engaging in dissolution of the capitalist theory of value and the dissolution of the power of the capitalist mode of production. That is sort of, I sense that some of this is going on in the background, which accounts for some of the language which you encounter here. And in particular, this thing on page 700, where he says, capital thus works towards its own dissolution as the form dominating production. That I would put in there, well, what other form could dominate production? And that applies also to this earlier kind of commentary about just because you're using a machine doesn't mean you're a capitalist. You could use machines technologically. So that there is a kind of an opening here in this text, I think, to these ideas. At the same time, the transformation of the power relation between labor and capital, in which labor in the earlier period monopolized skills and knowledge and all the rest of it, and therefore the capitalist had to actually be nice to the laborers, particularly the skilled ones, because they had the capacity to engage in the kind of production that needed to be organized. But a lot of that disappears, and so one of the themes of this chapter is the disempowerment of labor, and then in particular the disempowerment of its role as having skills, knowledge and understanding. In fact, the skills, knowledge and understanding of the artisan laborer become irrelevant in the face of this. And secondly, it's not only that it becomes irrelevant, what you find is that the whole kind of question of how to think about the labor theory of value, where we've thought about it in terms of individuals and their productive laborer, when you get a machine technology and you're thinking about a factory, and not only a factory, but a whole sort of factory system of integrated flows of commodities going between one factory and another as inputs and outputs, and you know, the kind of machine technology which we now have, that is something where the question of is the individual laborer productive or not becomes irrelevant. So the idea that, well, okay, A, laborer can kind of say, well, A, I'm productive, B, I command skills and knowledge and understanding, all of that gets wiped out by the transition into science and technology and the arrival of machine technology. And what this does is, at the same time as it's leading potentially to the dissolution of the dominating mode of production, it's also producing a communality in labor, in which it's the mass of the laborers which is going to be the focus of attention rather than individual labor. And the result of this is, he says, that this elevation of direct labor into social labor, that is, it's the labor of the collectivity, the laboring mass. The elevation of direct labor into social labor appears as a reduction of individual labor to the level of helplessness in face of the communality represented by and concentrated in capital. So this is quite a shift, and so the helplessness of the laborer starts then to redefine the nature of what class struggle is about. Whereas the skilled laborer had a certain power to withdraw their labor, and in withdrawing their labor, they could actually stop capital producing. That power is no longer there. Individual laborers can't do anything. They're subsumed within the working mass, and the working mass in the factory is what really matters. And one person can try and go on strike in the factory, but if one person goes on strike and the others don't, then this is a powerless situation. So this is changing the dynamics of class struggle away from sort of the individual framework in which it was cast earlier in the text to a communal framework, a social framework, and one in which the relevant way of thinking about labor is not as individuals, but of thinking of the laboring mass and how the laboring mass is constituted by machine technologies and the machine system. So this is, if you like, the opening argument. And the result of that is that you then get a change in tone. in which it is the mass which really matters. So we're going to talk about mass production. We're now going to have to talk about mass consumption. And we're going to have to talk about the laboring mass. In other words, we're now going to be talking about the mass. And this is a terrible. And on 702, Marx comments that machinery enters only where labor capacity is on hand in masses. And he promises then to return to this. Okay, this is a transition in the text, which is trying to mirror a transition which is going on in Manchester industrialism of the time and the like. Then on the bottom of 702, he says this: while up to now fixed capital and circulating capital appeared merely as different passing aspects of capital, they have now hardened into two particular modes of its existence. And fixed capital appears separately alongside circulating capital. There are now two particular kinds of capital. Insofar as a capital is examined in a particular branch of production, it appears as divided into these two portions, or splits into these two kinds of capital in certain proportions. So this idea of capital now splitting into these two forms, circulating capital and fixed capital, is going to become critical, because the laws of motion of fixed capital are very different from the laws of motion of circulating capital. Up till now, we've been really dealing with the idea that there's only one set of laws of motion which you need to look at, which are those which are given by the whole argument about absolute and relative surplus value and accumulation and the like. So, but now we're kind of saying, well, actually, the laws of motion look different when you ask, well, what are the laws of motion of fixed capital? And what are the laws of motion of circulating capital? And what happens when the only way in which you can create fixed capital is through the operation of circulating capital? In other words, circulating capital can't be seen as entirely separate from fixed capital, and fixed capital affects circulating capital because fixed capital affects the productivity of labor wherever it's deployed. So fixed capital and circulating capital are now being considered and hardened as two different circulatory processes, which are, however, intimately related. I guess, if I went back to the sort of the analogy of the human body, you would kind of say, well, you can look at the heart and the circulation of the blood, and you can look at the lungs and the circulation of oxygen. But at a certain point, what is critical is the relationship between the two. That a human body depends upon that relation being well established and mutually supportive. At the same time, as of course, there are very different processes at work in terms of each circulatory process. And you go to the pulmonary specialist if you've got a problem with your lungs, you go to the cardiologist if you have a problem with your heart, and so on. So what Marx is proposing is something like that we have to think about the two circulation processes as different and composed in different ways, but they're intimately related, and the intimate relation is therefore significant. And Marx makes much of the Adam Smith argument that all fixed capital originates in circulating capital. But then it turns out you can turn it around and say that all circulating capital depends upon machines to operate, and therefore it's a reciprocal version. So Marx then starts to look at the circulation of fixed capital more firmly. And on the bottom of 703, he says this: the value of fixed capital is reproduced only insofar as it is used up in the production process. Through disuse, it loses its use value without its value passing off to the product. Hence, the greater the scale on which fixed capital develops, in the sense in which we regard it here, the more does the continuity of the production process of the constant flow of reproduction become an externally compelling condition for the mode of production founded on capital. Now, what does this mean? Okay, you have fixed capital. You produce through circulating capital. You produce a machine and you sell the machine. So the machine is sold, and the machine's going to be used for 10 years or something like that by a direct producer. The value, as we've seen, flows back according to the use of that machine over a 10-year or 15-year period, however the lifetime is calculated. So, but the value only flows back provided that production continues. So if production ceases for any reason, then the value ceases to flow back into the value, into the product. And if that happens, then that means that the value that's in the residual value in the machine is lost. All right? It's devalued. So in other words, selling the machine to a producer presumes that producer will use the machine consistently over 10 years and can do that, and is not faced with the problem of getting rid of the interrupting the machine or interrupting production and so on. So this is one element of connectivity between circulating and fixed capital. And then he adds something which is very significant. In machinery, the appropriation of living labor by capital achieves a direct reality in this respect. It is, firstly, the analysis and application of mechanical and chemical laws arising directly out of science, which enables the machine to perform the same labor as that previously performed by the worker. However, the development of machinery along this path occurs only when large industry has already reached a higher stage. In other words, elaborate machinery doesn't work if you've got lots of very small production units around. I mean, machinery only works when already capital has arrived at a certain scale of activity. And Marx is kind of saying it's only when capital has got to that scale level where it makes it not only practical but necessary that you introduce machinery into the production process. I mean, if you have 10 handloom weavers scattered over a peasant economy, it's very hard to imagine that they would want to, any of them would actually think about or want or need a power loom. It doesn't make sense. A power loom only makes sense when you've got 100 laborers working on in a factory of some kind. So already Marx is kind of saying it's only when production is scaled up to a certain level, and that prior scaling up becomes important in the history, because when it's scaled up at a certain point, it makes sense that, okay, I can start to introduce automation. I can start to introduce machinery. And machinery, of course, aids and abets the scaling up. So what he's talking about here is a scaling up process, which begins before machines, brings capital to the point where a machine logic makes sense. Machine logic makes sense, and it scales up even further, and therefore more machine logic makes sense. And the machine logic makes sense not only in cotton, but also in the cotton gin and dyeing and energy production and so on. So the whole kind of game of capital, if you like, is transformed by scaling up. And the scaling up comes prior to the introduction of machine technologies, but machine technologies then aid and abet the further scaling up. And further, the developed machinery along this path occurs only when large industry has already reached a higher stage. And all sciences have been pressed into the service of capital. And when, secondly, the available machinery itself already provides great capabilities. And here comes a very crucial intervention. Invention, says Marx, then becomes a business, and the application of science to direct production itself becomes a prospect which determines and solicits it. Invention becomes a business. Now this in the history of capital, this is incredibly important. Initially, invention was about people trying to find better ways to do the work they were doing. So, you're cotton spinning and you're looking for something and to improve the productivity of labor in the cotton industry. And so Arkwright comes along with the power loom and everything. So, but notice this: the incentive for the invention is to try to improve the social productivity in a particular labor process, right? So that is what initially invention was about. But here Marx is saying something else. He's saying invention becomes a business. And it becomes a business because you start to invent things which have multiple uses, which are no longer confined to cotton industry or some particular place, but which actually have widespread applications all over the place. In other words, there's a transition that goes from invention, which is about particular technologies for particular labor processes, of which, you can historically see lots of examples, to the idea that, well, you just want to invent machines for the sake of inventing machines and then look around and see what the uses might be. And, of course, the big example in Marx's time was the steam engine. The steam engine had multiple uses. It wasn't as if somebody was kind of looking at the problem of mine drainage and said, okay, we've got to have a specific answer to this, and the answer is the steam engine. No, the answer was the steam engine was being developed anyway as a generic technology, and it had applications in terms of mine drainage. It has applications in terms of power loom use. It had the use, of course, in transportation and steam engines and things like that. And you would look at something today like digital technologies. How many spheres of activity can you apply digital technologies and so on? And in other words, there's a bourgeois book about Slouching to Utopia, which argues, and I think this is probably correct in a way, that one of the most innovative aspects of capitalist organization were the technological laboratories, Bell telephones, Dell, and so on. And it is the research universities. So what are research universities doing? They're coming up with new technologies to do what? Well, you come up with them to find new uses for them. So Marx introduces the idea that invention was becoming a business, and the business was the creation of generic technologies, which not only improved the social productivity of labor, but which also came up with new products. Where did the cell phone come from? And it is the research laboratories and the research universities that played a very important role in this. But in Marx's time, it was relatively confined, but Marx is seeing very clearly that when invention became a business, it would give a whole different dynamic to the capitalist mode of production. That we would start to see generic technologies developing, new products be coming out, and the applications of all of this would far exceed the kinds of technologies which came out of particular technologies designed for particular purposes. So this phrase about invention becomes a business. Now, I got sort of disappointed in the fact that Marx didn't spend much time talking about what kind of business it was and where the business would be conducted and what it would be about. But we can do some of that. And we could say that the development of the research universities, and of course the military kind of side of this is important too, generic technologies which have military applications, and all of that. Those were springing up when Marx was writing. One of the first research universities of this kind was the University of Berlin, which was organized by William Humboldt, and the University of Berlin became a model for many research universities in the United States. Johns Hopkins, where I once taught, was founded very much on the model of the Berlin University. You get universities like MIT, Caltech, and all the rest of it, which are essentially the major research universities. And for a long time now, people have understood that one of the advantages of the United States in terms of its capitalist dynamic is research universities, which then makes it even more ridiculous that they're putting cuts on spending on research universities, because that's where a lot of the dynamism has come from historically. But then Marx goes on to say that the application of science to direct production becomes a prospect which determines and solicits the generating of new inventions. But he says, this is not the road along which machinery by and large arose, and even less the road on which it progresses in detail. The road is, rather, dissection through the division of labor, which gradually transforms the workers' operations into more and more mechanical ones, so that at a certain point, mechanism can step into their places. Now, at the end of the 19th century, there was this process called Taylorism, and Marx is referring to that here. He doesn't call it that. But Taylorism was a movement in which production processes, which were considered an art, and therefore involved a lot of guesswork, were broken down into small pieces which could be easily done and scientifically constructed. So that you would take a production process and you would break it down into its constituent parts, and you could automate the production of each one of those constituent parts. So here you have two models, if you like. One is a macro model of invention becoming a business, and you're going to sell pharmaceutical products to everybody, and you can get pharmaceutical products which have no immediate application, so you have to invent diseases to match the products, which is not an unknown phenomena in pharmaceutical innovation. So you have that kind of thing, and then the other thing is the breaking down of complex systems into component parts, each of which can be. But that again is going to be a mass thing, because it only makes sense to do that when you're producing many steam engines as opposed to just producing one steam engine. So Marx is actually, I think, in a rather brilliant way, summarizing something here about the paths of innovation in the capitalist society. That it goes from the particular to the universal, and the universal has two passages, one towards generic technologies and new products, and the other towards the dismantling, if you like, of a complex production process into component parts. And Taylor kind of said the component parts should be so simple they could be actually done by a trained gorilla. That was his kind of argument, somewhat strange argument. So Marx here then, in just this one passage, is opening up this whole kind of idea And I think it's important that we run with it and think about how it has affected and continues to affect. So that artificial intelligence is a generic kind of thing, and the same question can be asked about it that Marx was asking about dissolution. To what degree will artificial intelligence permit the dissolution of current practices and lead to their own reconstitution around a socialist model, as opposed to their constitution as a capitalist enterprise? So those are the questions which, it seems to me, lurk in the text here. Marx then talks about the contradiction that's involved in a lot of this. And here I think we have some very interesting observations and some rather complex ones. And he says, the exchange of living labour for objectified labour, that is, means of production, machines, etc., i.e. the positing of social labour in the form of the contradiction of capital and wage labour, is the ultimate development of the value relation and of production resting on value. Its presupposition is and remains the mass of direct labour time, the quantity of labour employed, as a determinant factor in the production of wealth. But to the degree that large industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less on labour time and on the amount of labour employed than on the power of the agencies set in motion during labour time, whose powerful effectiveness is itself in turn out of all proportion to the direct labour time spent on their production, but depends rather on the general state of science and the progress of technology, or the application of this science to production. So real wealth then depends less on labour time and the amount of labour employed, and more upon the powerful effectiveness of science, technology, which is embodied in now embodied in the labour process. Real wealth, he goes on to say, manifests itself rather, and large industry reveals this, in the monstrous disproportion between the labour time applied, a few labourers managing and minding the machines, the monstrous disproportion between the labour time applied and its product, as well as in the qualitative imbalance between labour reduced to a pure abstraction and the power of the production process it superintends. So the relationship between labour and the machine is now central to what is going on in terms of the labour process. And that relationship is such that a few labourers can produce a monstrous amount of product. The machine just churns it out. And the result is that the human being comes to relate more as watchman and regulator for the production process. And this industrial process takes on a different form. It becomes, he says, as a means between himself and inorganic nature. He steps to the side of the production process instead of being its chief actor. In this transformation, it is neither the direct human labour he himself performs, nor the time during which he works, but rather the appropriation of his own general productive power, his understanding of nature, and the mastery over it by virtue of his presence as a social body. It is, in a word, the development of the social individual, which appears as the great foundation stone of production and of wealth. So you're looking at a machine system, multiple machines all producing parts for other machines and all the rest of it. Just imagining this whole system. And a few labourers are there just looking after it. And labour time at that point becomes, pretty minuscule compared to the mass of the output. And in a sense, what this means is that all of the skill and knowledge and understanding which the laborer used to have has now been embodied in the machines. So the laborer has lost them. They've been alienated, if you like, and are now embedded in the machines. And furthermore, the machines are being developed in such a way that the laborer cannot possibly understand them. So the powerlessness, which Marx has been noting, comes back. And furthermore, the sense of what an individual laborer is about is being transformed into this social mass of workers. So you not only have just a few workers producing an immense amount of product, but you have a lot of those workers actually producing even more mass product. And so this leads Marx to observe the following. As soon as labour in a direct form has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth, labour time ceases and must cease to be its measure, and hence exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. Again, it comes back to this idea of dissolution. The labour theory of value is disappearing in the face of the machine technologies. Doesn't make sense to say, the measure of value is the four labourers who are producing this enormous mass of product. Doesn't make sense. So Marx is kind of saying, this ceases to be the great wellspring of wealth. Labour, time ceases and must cease to be its measure. The surplus value of the mass, he goes on to say, has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, just as the non-labour of the few for the development of the general powers of the human head. Non-labour of the few is, of course, the capitalist. With that, production based on exchange value breaks down, and the direct material production process is stripped of the form of penury and antithesis. The free development of individualities, and hence not the reduction of necessary labour time so as to posit surplus value, that is, relative surplus value, but rather the general reduction of the necessary labour of society to a minimum, which then corresponds to the artistic, scientific development of the individuals in the time set free, and with the means created for all of them. Capital itself, he says, is the moving contradiction. So this is the moving contradiction. On the one hand, the labour is becoming less and less relevant. Their skills become irrelevant. Their skills appropriated, taken away. The labourer is becoming more and more powerless. At the same time, the productivity that is going on is such that necessary labour can actually be reduced to a minimum. And in fact, what this does is to release a vast amount of surplus value. All right? But surplus value, in the first instance, is not taking the form of surplus value. It's taking the form of free time. And this is where Marx really gets into the kind of question of free time. On the one side, then, he says, this system he's talking about calls to life all the powers of science and of nature, as of social combination and social intercourse, in order to make the creation of wealth independent relatively of the labour time employed on it. On the other side, it wants to use labour time as the measuring rod for the giant social forces thereby created, and to confine them within the limits required to maintain the already created value as value. Now, this is the contradiction. That you're going to try and maintain the labour theory of value at the heart of everything, because that is the way in which that is the capitalist law of value. So the capitalist law of value is going to be a struggle to maintain it somehow or other, at the same time as it is dissolving in the face of the helplessness of the individual laborers who cannot really now have lost the prospect of revolting against the capitalists. Forces of production and social relations, two different sides of the development of the social individual, appear to capital as mere means, and are merely means for it to produce on its limited foundation. In fact, however, they are the material conditions to blow this foundation sky high. So Marx is seeing something in here about how, this whole kind of transformation which is taking place is undermining the logic of capital accumulation as it has so far been constructed, and is threatening to blow it sky high. Though I can't actually quite figure out exactly what the logic is of this piece of the argument. He says, and this goes back to the two sources that he's reading at this time. Truly wealthier nation when the working day is 6 rather than 12 hours. Wealth is not command over surplus labor time, but rather disposable time outside that needed in direct production for every individual and the whole society. Now he's quoting here from that anonymous pamphlet, every individual, which is the source and remedy of the problems. And then comes what I think is one of the key elements in this thing. Nature builds no machines, no locomotives, railways, electric telegraphs, self-acting mules. These are products of human industry, natural material transformed into organs of the human will over nature, or of human participation in nature. They're organs of the human brain, created by the human hand, the power of knowledge objectified. The development of fixed capital indicates, this goes back to the first statement we made, to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life itself have come under the control of the general intellect and been transformed in accordance with it. To what degree the powers of social production have been produced, not only in the form of knowledge, but also as immediate organs of social practice of the real life process. Now, this is a much discussed paragraph, and I think you have to make up your mind how you want to read it. I mean, I can read it some way, you can read it another way. There's plenty of ambiguity here, so plenty of opportunity to exercise your imagination on it. But when he says the development of fixed capital indicates to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life itself have come under the control of the general intellect and been transformed in accordance with it. What is this general intellect? What is meant by the general intellect? At this point, many people have argued that what Marx is arguing for is the generalization of the human power of imagination and the human knowledge and structure over the paths of development of capital. This would be consistent with an argument that he makes in Capital when he's discussing the labor process, when he says what distinguishes the worst of architects from the best of bees is this: that the architect erects a structure in imagination before realizing it upon the ground. Now, many people, of course, are opposed to the idealist interpretation of or any hint of an idealist interpretation of historical transformation. But in that comment on the labour process, Marx opens a space in which human imagination precedes the actual construction of what goes on the ground. In other words, the architect lays out a plan, says this is what I want to build, and builds it. So, and that issue of what separates the worst of architects from the best of bees is a much founded. Now, you can say that there's an echo of that in here, except what Marx is saying here is that human beings armed with all this chemical, technological, scientific, engineering, etc. knowledge are in a position to design, if you like, how the capitalist system should look and how it should work. That it doesn't come about by the laws of motion which have been discussed earlier in Capital. It comes about by conscious application and the combination of the human head and the human hand, which are in effect going to design the world around us. And that when you look at the world around us and you see locomotives, railways, electric telegraphs, self-acting mules, etc., you look at it and you say, oh, well, that just didn't arise out of nothing. That arose because the worst of architects and the best of bees actually defines the world in which we're living, in which, of course, would then allow for discussion, contest, argument, fighting, struggle, etc., over exactly what it is that the architect might do, exactly what might be done, given the general the degree of general social knowledge. Now, this has led some people to say that Marx is arguing for a transition from the pure capitalism that he starts out analyzing, which gets transformed, as we've seen, as soon as fixed capital circulation comes into the picture, which then gets transformed again as the general social intellect starts to intervene in the capitalist process and to redesign the capitalist world around us. And to what degree is the capitalist world around us redesigned, if you like, according to the principles of the general intellect. And as a result of that, people say, well, we're now in a stage of capitalism called cognitive capitalism, where it's the knowledge which is created within the general intellect which is actually the driving force. Okay. My own take on this is to go back a little bit to the whole kind of question of what happens when innovation becomes a business. And I think it's important to realize that knowledge, which he invokes here and says, you know, the organs of the human brain created by the human hand, the power of knowledge objectified. But it's not as if all knowledge is relevant to this. It is only the knowledge which gets embedded in fixed capital. In other words, while this statement here can be treated as something which is expansive, that therefore, you know, I imagine a world made of green cheese and I go out and I make the world green cheese or something of this kind, you know, that sort of thing. No, Marx is kind of saying no. It's broad in the sense that it's expansive in one direction, but it's also more restrictive in another direction, in the sense that it is only the knowledge that gets transformed into the practical technologies of machines and machine processes and machine systems. It's only that aspect of knowledge which is relevant here. It's not all knowledge. and it's technical scientific knowledge, and therefore the scientific laboratories that are producing the new knowledges and the new military equipments and all the rest of it are the sorts of things that Marx has in mind. Nature does not produce missiles. Missiles get produced, for certain reasons, but again, you can understand the logic of missile production in a certain way, rather than just saying, well, somebody thought it would be fun to make a missile. Well, I'm sure somebody somewhere did have an idea that they would make a missile or go to the moon or something. So maybe somebody thought that, but what Marx is saying is it's only that, at least I think he's saying, it's only that knowledge which can be made real. So when Marx kind of says what separates the worst of architects from the best of bees is that the architect erects it in the imagination before erecting it on the ground. Architects can have all kinds of plans, but it has to be erected on the ground, and therefore the historical materialist constraint comes in and kind of says, well, yes, knowledge and so on is terribly important, and it can indicate all kinds of things, but it's only that which gets erected on the ground, and that which gets erected on the ground is dependent upon the introduction of science and technology into fixed capital formation, which is operating under the rule of capital. So while there are all sorts of possibilities here for socialism to intervene, we know, I think, that the way this is going to be worked out is under the rules of, it's going to be concretized, if you like, and turned into a reality. That reality is going to be largely created under the subsumed within, if you like, the logic of capital, rather than subsumed within the logic of an alternative socialism. This then leads him, 707, into talk a little bit about the development of fixed capital indicates, in still another respect, the degree of development of wealth generally, of capital. Again, this is about how the future might be oriented by the capacity entailed in fixed capital formation. The aim of production oriented directly towards use value, as well as of that directly oriented towards exchange value, is the product itself destined for consumption. The part of production which is oriented towards the production of fixed capital does not produce direct objects of individual gratification, nor direct exchange values, at least not directly realizable exchange values. Hence, only when a certain degree of productivity has already been reached, and we get this idea, only when a certain scale and possibility, and when a certain degree of productivity has already been reached, so that a part of production time is sufficient for immediate production, can an increasingly large part be applied to the production of means of production. This requires that society be able to wait. That is, you invest in fixed capital, the return of value of fixed capital comes over a number of years. And in fact, in many instances, like a railroad, you're building a railroad and it takes you 2 or 3 years to build it, and during those 2 or 3 years, you're not producing anything. So you're laying things out without getting anything back for a number of years. And this raises all sorts of interesting kind of problems. But then finally, as you go on into 708, 709, Marx comes back to some of the issues that were discussed in the earlier part of this analysis, which is the idea of disposable time. here he says on 708, the creation of a large quantity of disposable time, apart from necessary labour time for society generally and each of its members, i.e. room for the development of individuals' full productive forces, hence those of society also. This creation of not labour time appears in the stage of capital, as of all other earlier ones, as not labour time, free time, but for a few. That is, capital is creating the possibility of free time. That free time is appropriated as and consumed by the upper classes. It has the free time to do what it wants. It is not available to the mass of the people because that free time is converted into surplus value. And what Marx is then going to say is, well, what would happen if free time was taken away from the creation of surplus value, which would actually then take away the means by which capital reproduces itself, and was converted into free time for the labourer. And this is the question that is then posed in the following pages. And finally, what this does is to pose the kind of question of what is the relationship between fixed capital and all of this argument which is coming out here and the perpetuation of circulating capital. And the answer here is that while fixed capital circulation is scaling up, if you like, there is a certain scaling down that is going on in circulating capital, which is productive of value. In other words, a lot of the argument about the disappearance of value and so on is contingent upon a society in which fixed capital dominates all else. But when you reintroduce circulating capital and the relationship between circulating capital and fixed capital, you get a much more nuanced picture. Yes, indeed, there is the disappearance, if you like, of the labourer through the fixed capital, but the application of fixed capital within the realm of circulating capital improves the productivity, reduces necessary labour time. So there's a very complex kind of relation which takes place in this. As he says, the creation of not labour time appears in the stage of capital, as of all earlier ones, as not labour time, free time for a few. Since valued directly, the appropriation of surplus labour time, since valued directly its purpose, not use value, it is thus, despite itself, instrumental in creating the means of social disposable time, in order to reduce labour time for the whole society to a diminishing minimum. This is the kind of the idea of the possible transition to socialism via this mechanism. If it succeeds too well at the first, then it suffers from surplus production. And then necessary labour is interrupted because no surplus labour can be realised by capital. The more this contradiction develops, the more does it become evident that the growth of the forces of production can no longer be bound up with the appropriation of alien labour, but that the mass of workers must themselves appropriate their own surplus labour. So the task of class struggle now is for the mass of the labourers to actually appropriate the mass of the surplus value. And it seems to me this is a kind of an observation which sort of, I don't know exactly how that would work and what kind of political movement would be able to do such a thing. But the hope is that on the one side, necessary labour time will be measured by the needs of the social individual. And on the other, the development of the power of social production will grow so rapidly that even though production is now calculated for the wealth of all, disposable time will grow for all. For real wealth is the developed productive power of all individuals. The measure of wealth is then not any longer in any way labour time, but rather disposable time. Labour time, as the measure of value, posits wealth itself as founded on poverty, and disposable time as existing in, and because of the antithesis to surplus labour time, or the positing of an individual's entire time as labour time, and its degradation therefore to mere worker, as subsumption under labour. The most developed machinery forces the worker to work longer than the savage does, or than he himself did with the simplest, crudest tools. I'm getting the sense here that the capitalist application of machinery is going to go in this highly negative direction at the same time as you're opening up all of these positive possibilities. And obviously from Marx's standpoint, the quest was on to try to get labour organised to take account of those positive possibilities of free time, because as capital gets hold of it in the same way that it dealt with all machinery ended up acting in a way which was disempowering to labour and increased the rate of exploitation of labour power. In Capital, Marx makes this observation. He said, John Stuart Mill could not understand why it was that machinery and technologies, science and so on, which had the capacity to reduce the burden of labouring for the mass of the population, ended up making the lives of the labourers much worse and conditions of labour much worse. And Marx argues, well, that's because the whole dynamic of technological and dynamic change was organised through capital, not through labour. Labour should enter and try to take command. But when it enters and tries to take command, it's going to have to take command of the mass. And it's going to have to take command at a certain scale. And as we know, it's very difficult for labour to operate at certain scales. These passages, I think, are really very interesting to work through. And I could go on, but I'm going to stop here to get to some of your reactions. But I think that they deserve a close reading and close thinking about how Marx is recognizing that the nature of capital is being transformed internally by the rise of fixed capital. And later on he'll kind of also say, well, fixed capital requires a credit system and finance and the location of loanable capital and all those kinds of things. So Marx is doing an interesting thing which we've got to get used to, which is he brings our understanding of capital up to a certain point, i.e. the point without fixed capital. He then introduces fixed capital, which revolutionizes that understanding and says, well, there's something completely different now going on, but then brings it back by kind of saying the relation between fixed and circulating capital is crucial, and therefore we've done the understanding of circulating capital earlier in the text. We've now done fixed capital, and we've now got to put them together. And he's starting to put them together and seeing all kinds of political possibilities as a result of that putting together, but also recognizing, as he does in the case of machinery, that the outcome could be disastrous for labour. The labourer is helpless, is subsumed within the mass. The mass is not in a position to appropriate the surplus value, therefore not in a position to appropriate the mechanism by which the capitalist class reproduces itself. This is a sort of argument that it seems to me is going on here. But as I say, this is a very problematic kind of stuff, and I have some position on it. You might look at it and take a thorough and close look at it and decide on alternative interpretations, and you'll certainly find interpretations of cognitive capital and the general intellect and all those kinds of things, which, to my mind, take take things a bit too far, leading into adjectival capitalism, like digital capitalism, cognitive capitalism, finance capitalism, and all the rest of it. But what we're seeing here is Marx at work in his own theoretical laboratory, in which he's trying to sort of use the powers of abstraction to say something significant about the nature of the system, the capitalist mode of production, which dominates our lives in all kinds of ways. So let's see if there are any kind of questions or comments that any of you want to make, and if there are any on...
Okay, so we're going to start the Q&A momentarily, but first, David, we need to fix your mic.
Fix the mic? Okay. Is it not working? Okay. All right. So, anybody got any comments about this? I'm sorry. Well, not sorry. I think it's a good idea to do a close reading of a piece of the text, just to sort of work with some of the complexity that Marx is working with. So, who has any kind of comments they want to make, or any questions? Yeah.
On that note, I feel like there's a sort of an ambiguity here, where Marx sometimes seems to be suggesting that, and it's a tension that runs throughout all of Marxism, I think, this sort of idea of sort of an automatic transition that isn't even political, that whereby labour really is reduced not just to a minimum, but in fact eliminated through the production process, and thereby, in essence, eliminating the class relation. I'm wondering what you think about that, and whether you think, in principle, according to the logic of Marx's text, and in empirical, reality today, if you think of that as a possibility. Now, that doesn't mean transitioning to communism, sorry, but it might mean that a different kind of relation, a non-capital relation, emerges.
Well, I think he sees the transitions occurring within capital towards an increasing mass and increasing employment of fixed capital, all of those sorts of transitions, as captive to the logic of capital. So in that sense, yes, it's a done deal. But what this does is, it seems to me, he wants to look at that and then ask the question: are there openings here for some alternatives to arise? And if so, what might those alternatives look like, and what would be the grounding of those alternatives? And that is not a done deal. That's where active class struggle comes in. But I think he's trying to say here, which is problematic from the standpoint of a lot of people on the left today, is that you're not going to get anything really substantial in terms of the transition to socialism without scaling up your thinking to deal with the science and the technology and how it's being deployed, and to deal with the laboring mass and the massive output and mass production and mass consumption and so on. In other words, I think he's trying to say there are certain avenues of class struggle that might have been there in the time of manufacturing, before the Manchester system, as it were, came into play, is those forms of class struggle have to be replaced by forms of class struggle which are actually going to deal with the scaling up. I mean, that would be my interpretation of it, which is a very uncomfortable definition, because I think most people politically today would resist the idea of a class struggle that is scaling up, because that would mean at a certain point somehow or other you're going to scale up to the capitalist state, and it's going to depend upon that scaling up in order to do what has to be done. So that would be, I think, partly how I would think of it, but that's not, I don't think that's given in the stars. I think there are different ways to think about that problem. But the contradictions are there. And I think it's better, rather than talking of ambiguities, to say, well, let's look at the contradictions. And the contradictions are there right now. That the possibility of disposable time is there. In Capital, Marx makes the kind of comment that the realm of freedom begins when the realm of necessity is left behind. In these passages which we're looking at, he starts to talk about, well, the realm of necessity can be covered so easily by science and technology and the forms of production which are coming into being, that in fact the realm of freedom can then thereby flourish. Why is capital so opposed to the realm of freedom for the mass of the population? Why does it want to keep the mass of the people in penury and in conditions of wage slavery? Why does it want to do that in the situation where the possibility exists of organizing the production of surplus in a different kind of way? So I think that's where I would go. But like I say, this is everybody can have their own opinion, and will have their own opinion about this, which is why I think it's a very exciting text. You can read it all sorts of different ways. You need to.
Thank you. So my question's quite geographical, and I wondered, when you talked about the invention becoming a business, you also talked about the new role of research universities. And my question would be, did then cities or regions that were able in this time to open up and to develop research universities, did they had advantages, and how could we build a spatial argument on this development? Thank you.
Yeah, I think the way in which research, as a business, became embedded in geopolitical struggles was important, and immediately the issue of military superiority comes in, and a lot of the research universities got their push from the military expenditures. So for this to happen, but this again, it comes back to Marx's kind of comment that to get into some of this stuff means that you need surpluses of capital and labor, well beyond what is needed for sustenance of the population, so that those places that had surpluses, and this comes back to the role of existing surpluses in creating more surpluses, that those countries which had surpluses and could afford to wait could also spend a lot of time developing new technologies. And as I say, part of this was oriented towards military concerns, and part of it was going to be oriented to what might be called security concerns, and the biggest security concern would be about transportation and communications structures, which have obviously civilian relevance, but at the same time, many people would say that, for instance, the interstate highway system in the United States was justified not because it was going to improve the productivity of labor, was justified for military security reasons. And to the degree that countries have surpluses, they can start upon this process. And as you get surpluses, you get more surpluses. I mean, this is Marx's point, that the scaling up is very, very critical. And so you get the dynamic in which, I mean, even bourgeois economists could recognize that rich regions tend to get richer. Because they have the wherewithal to get richer, and because they attract talent and they attract activity. And in fact, one of the things we've seen in the world over the last 30 years is a metropolitanization of a lot of economic activity, so that we get sort of rural deserts and metropolitan concentrations of wealth. So that's where the geography tends to come in, and everybody dreams of creating their own little Silicon Valley, but it's hard to. It turns out it's hard to do. The Scots tried it and called them Silicon Glens, those sorts of things. So you get a lot of that attempt. The role of the state in a lot of this is, of course, important. In Japan, it was a state function research city, actually, where research into new products and new modes of production took place, and MITI became the basis of Japanese research superiority in the 1960s, 1970s. Produced the superior cars of the 1980s, and so the geography of it then depends very much on the concatenation of forces that exist in particular parts of the world. But you find I lived, well, didn't live, but I participated in a passage in Ecuador, where the idea in Ecuador was that Ecuador would try to redesign itself as a Switzerland of the Andes, and that they would have research institutions, and they decided to set up something like 6 research universities. They actually produced one, and it was a bit of a disaster because you just didn't have the infrastructure around, and if you wanted to get the talent to do it, you had to hire people. So they were paying enormous salaries to people from MIT to come, from Caltech actually, to come and spend a couple of weeks in Ecuador redesigning the research university for Ecuador, which would put Ecuador in the front runner of, never happened, of course. Was the infrastructure was not there, and the possibility was not there, and I recall commenting with the Minister of Higher Education that this was a crazy idea and wouldn't work, and I wasn't the only one who was saying that, and of course it didn't really work. Yeah.
My question is, how does capital preserve the labor theory of value? And I'm wondering if it is it explicitly I'm wondering what it has to do with kind of the increasing, the introduction of fixed capital machinery into the production processes, which then create these surplus populations, which can be partially absorbed into more labor-intensive industries and firms, which then kind of creates the conditions for new cycles of accumulation, new cycles of competition. Is the labor theory of value preserved through just the laws of motion of capital itself, or is it a more consciously and explicitly politically necessitated project to preserve, or is it? I guess kind of the secondary part of the question is this tendency that Marx is identifying here towards capital's self-abolition through the introduction of fixed capital, does that really only obtain at a certain scale? Because it would seem that once you get big enough, it kind of works itself out, really, and it is able to sustain itself over time.
Yeah, I mean, Marx himself in those passages suggests that there will always be a certain labor-intensive productive activity within the sphere of circulating capital, which is necessary, if you like, to support the circulation of fixed capital. So whether that is sufficient to preserve the overall configuration of the labor theory of value as it's emerging in the text at that time, I have no idea. The other possibility is that the exploration of new. Put it this way. Bourgeois policymakers and thinkers and so on are very well aware that labor absorption is a terribly important issue for an economy. You see this most clearly in China. That China is very nervous about mass unemployment. China recognizes that in order to maintain the integrity of the Communist Party, it needs to provide adequate employment opportunities to mass of the population that is increasingly educated. And so in a way, if you look at the argument that's going on here, you would say that Chinese government policy would be to address questions of labor absorption in such a way that labor intensity, which is the grounding of the labor theory of value, would be perpetuated. I mean, it's a bit odd to kind of say the Chinese are perpetuating the labor theory of value. I'm sure they wouldn't want to be. But in effect, that's what you would end up doing if you just did that on your own. So that when the Chinese lost a lot of workers, a lot of laboring jobs in 2008 because of the collapse of the U.S. consumer market, they lost, some estimates put it as high as 30 million jobs. Well, they set to work to provide labor in a vast investment in fixed capital on the idea that circulating capital is the basis for producing fixed capital. So circulating capital is mobilized, and they probably created about 27 million jobs in 1 year within circulating capital to produce the fixed capital and the high-speed rail network, the motorways, the underground rails, the new cities. They built whole new cities with nobody living in them, things like that. So it's a massive kind of investment in fixed capital formation, which meant an enormous demand for circulating capital, which is labor intensive. So now you look at construction and say, well, is construction, can you just automate it entirely? And the answer is no, it's hard to do that, even with mass machinery. What happens is that you get a monstrous mass of built environment. Just traveling through China, they have these new areas they're urbanizing, and it goes on for miles. And the interesting thing is they build the road network first, and they plant trees to show where the road network. So you see this weird landscape with winding kind of things like this with trees everywhere, and people say, oh well, 3 years' time be full of houses or shops or whatever. It's all designed. So yeah, you can by public policy decisions, you can certainly get the labor intensity sectors working very well, and that of course would mean the labor theory value was effective. But the Chinese are not at the point where they can actually claim to have abolished the labor theory of value. And the big problem for them is it possible to take advantage of some of these issues here, and what to do about labor time. I don't know if you know this, there was a sort of a resistance movement amongst particularly younger employees who were resistant to the sort of the labor process, which was 6 days a week for 9 hours a day, and they resisted it by lying flat. Since protests on the street were not really possible, they quickly got picked up and thrown in jail. They just stayed at home and laid flat and refused to work, which was an interesting form of protest. But you know, Chinese have only begun, I think, to understand that disposable time might be something that is worthwhile looking at. In this country, disposable time is not a big issue, but and it should be. So I really don't know what this relationship, how the relationship between fixed and capital, fixed and circulating capital will work out, and how it will work out in relationship to labor theory of value. I think what Marx is saying is that fixed capital in itself is likely to lead to the abolition of the labor theory of value. Circulating capital, it's another story. And how that relates is, I think, probably an empirical question. Any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, we may as well...
Yeah, we don't have questions online, so...
Okay. So maybe we'll stop here and continue next time with the next session. Okay? Right. So I don't know whether you appreciated this close reading or thought it was a good idea. I thought it might be a good idea to go through closely, particularly these passages. But anyway, we'll see. So, thanks.